Few things intrigue and terrify man like the specter of his own destruction. Through cinematic, artistic, and literary mediums, we fight and glorify death on a daily basis. In partial attempt to cope with our mortality, we fixate on real-life killers, rationalizing their existence whenever possible, and sometimes turning them into accidental celebrities. The more twisted or troubled a murderer seems, the more eagerly we wish to dissect that person's motives and mindset. It's only natural that killers with inscrutably odd fixations both rivet and repulse us. Matthew Hoffman, Trees. When police entered the Ohio home of 30-year-old Matthew Hoffman, they found an arboreal hellscape of leaves blanketing the entire house. Hundreds of bags of leaves, none of which Hoffman had ever been seen raking, filled the bathroom. Some parts of the house had been packed so densely that the officers feared they would find bodies buried underneath. In the basement was a 13-year-old girl whom Hoffman had snatched from her home 4 days earlier. She was bound by her hands and been dressed in a trash bag diaper. She was on a bed of leaves draped with blankets. When authorities finally freed the girl, she asked to be transported to school for fear of being too tardy. She heartbreakingly anguished over the fate of her dog, which Hoffman had killed for being too noisy, but the killer had also committed far graver sins. The girl didn't realize it at the time, but her mother, little brother, and a young neighbor were all dead, killed during a botched robbery attempt, and then callously cut to pieces. Hoffman had hidden their remains in the hollow of a 65-foot-tall tree. Psychologists would later suggest that he had chosen their wooden resting place to bring himself comfort. The tree obsession, they suggested, indicated a severe mental imbalance and delusional thinking. No shit. It was an imbalance that characterized most of Hoffman's life. Ever since childhood, Hoffman had surrounded himself with trees. He climbed them, played in them, and built tree houses. He worked with them in adulthood part-time as a tree trimmer, before getting released for falsifying his work history and unnerving his boss. In the end, he would make trees inanimate accomplices in his grotesque transgressions. Hoffman willingly admitted his atrocities in court, earning him a life sentence without parole. Roger Reese Kibbe, cutting women's clothing. Long before Robert Kibbe became known as the I-5 Strangler, he exhibited strong signs of depravity. A frequent ward of the juvenile justice system, Kibbe would regularly skip school to steal women's undergarments. Using his mother's scissors, he would then cut amorphous holes in them. He also broke into 13 other people's garages and falsely claimed to have been molested by kidnappers. One of Kibbe's arresting juvenile officers uneasily pondered whether the troubled child would go on to become a dangerous man. Years later, Kibbe would validate those concerns in the worst way. Between 1977 and 1987, Kibbe terrorized the female population of North Carolina. During that decade-long interval, he kidnapped, raped, and choked 7 women to death. Echoing the habits of his youth, Kibbe cut holes in their clothing. In at least one instance, he ripped out some of the victim's hair and wrapped it into a portion of her underwear. Initially, Kibbe was only tried and convicted for one of his many murders, that of a 17-year-old, Darcy Frankenpole. In 1987, he was sentenced to serve 25 years to life in prison. However, 13 years after his conviction, advancements in forensic science implicated the I-5 strangler in 6 more murders. He admitted to killing to avoid capital punishment and subsequently helped investigators recover all the bodies except one. Investigators fear, however, that the true tally of victims could be much, much higher. Danilo Restivo, haircutting. In September of 1993, an Italian teenager indulged the advances of an awkward older suitor against her well-formed reservations. The girl, 16-year-old Elisa Claps, had heard uncomfortable rumors about the seemingly oafish Danilo Restivo. Restivo, it was said, sat behind women on buses and surreptitiously cut their hair. Despite his creepy conduct, Claps pitied Restivo and agreed to meet him at church. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. From the start, everyone suspected Restivo had killed the poor girl, but no one could find a body, and Restivo, despite seemingly childlike and unthinking, had the savvy to meticulously cover his own tracks. Fast forward 9 years, and Elisa Claps remained one of Italy's most famous missing persons. By that time, Restivo had resettled in the English town of Bournemouth, where he would kill again. In 2002, Restivo murdered and mutilated Heather Barnett, leaving clippings of his victim's hair in her hands. Barnett's children, who discovered her body, recalled that Restivo had visited their home before the family's house keys vanished, but concrete evidence linking him to the murder was sorely lacking. And investigators delved into Restivo's life. However, they found numerous red flags. Again, no shit. As a boy, Restivo had been traumatized by an unsuccessful tonsil surgery and seemingly acted out by torturing other children. Police also discovered his hair fetish. Interviewers of Bournemouth residents suggested that Restivo had cut the hair of at least 2 schoolgirls. A witness also spotted him masturbating to a woman's hair on a bus. Then, a forensic breakthrough. Authorities found DNA residue placing Restivo at the scene of Barnett's murder. But even then, the composed killer produced a coherent explanation. Justice finally prevailed in 2010 when Elisa Claps' body was discovered in Italy, along with traces of Restivo's DNA. Her hair had also been cut and placed in her hands. This time, the evidence was inescapable. In 2011, a court condemned Restivo to a life in prison. What do you guys think, life in prison or the death penalty? You tell me in the comments section. On to the next one. Ricky Brogsdale, violent voyeurism. Ricky Brogsdale's best friend growing up were hardship and dysfunction. The son of a violent alcoholic mother, he turned to drugs early in life and engaged in an untoward affair with a half-sister. During his teenage years, the wayward Brogsdale constantly landed himself in juvenile detention for a series of offenses that include battery and rape. In adulthood, his most aberrant transgressions would be fueled by violence and voyeurism. Brogsdale reached the peak of his perversion in 1987. In May that year, he was granted parole after serving a partial sentence for possessing an unlicensed firearm. Within 2 months of his release, he got himself rearrested for indecent exposure. However, the parole board showed leniency and declined to detain him before his upcoming trial date, rather than rescinding parole altogether. Brogsdale would use that pre-trial interlude to shoot 7 people. Over a span of 6 weeks, the pathological Brogsdale prowled the neighborhoods of southeast Washington, D.C. for targets. Once he settled on someone, usually a woman, he would peep at them through their window, Sometimes he would masturbate during this activity. To achieve full satisfaction, Brogsdale aimed and fired once at the object of his arousal. In his quest for gratification, the so-called Peeping Tom killer ended 2 lives and marred multiple others. At trial, Brogsdale's attorneys defended him as a tortured soul who only meant to sate a diseased hunger, born of horrid childhood abuse. That was little solace to the families of the deceased and the survivors he permanently scarred. A D.C. court found Brogsdale guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to 63 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 55 years. David Tarloff, his mother. David Tarloff's neighbors knew him as a crazy guy, slim and fashionable in his youth. Tarloff aged into a tragically unstable man in the throes of a schizophrenic meltdown. He dressed sloppily, often neglecting to fully button his shirts and zip up his pants. He habitually stole cat food and Yoo-hoo from a Manhattan store that he frequented. At night, Tarloff could often be heard screaming at his elderly mother. Kind of reminds me of the Psycho plot. Despite the rockiness of their dynamic, Tarloff loved his 73-year-old mother, Beatrice, intensely. When she ultimately had to enter a nursing home, he rapidly unraveled. An inconsolable Tarloff began frequenting her new abode and issuing death threats to employees who were forced to boot him off the premises. Tarloff's father grew so distressed about his son's irrational behavior that he relocated Beatrice Tarloff to a new facility, but her son always managed to find her. Throughout Tarloff's tailspin, police and close relatives tried to have him committed to a mental facility. Each time he was released after a brief stay thanks to a revolving door system of admissions for dangerous patients. The consequences of that proved dire. Having convinced himself that his mother was being mistreated, Tarloff devised a crude scheme to whisk her away to Hawaii or out of the country entirely. Instead, he cost an innocent woman her life. Tarloff planned to finance his getaway by robbing psychiatrist Kent Shinback, who had Tarloff hospitalized in 1991. Instead, the would-be bandit encountered therapist Catherine Fahey. A panicked Tarloff responded by stabbing her 15 times with a meat cleaver and cracking her cranium with a mallet. Mental health professionals would find Tarloff incompetent to stand trial 3 different times. In 2014, 6 years after Dr. Fahey's death, a jury convicted him of second-degree murder, among other charges. He is slated to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Dayton Leroy Rogers, feet in bondage. As an 18-year-old, Dayton Leroy Rogers asked a 15-year-old girl to close her eyes, and then stabbed her in the stomach. It was an act of spontaneous savagery that few people would consider, but which came naturally to a man driven by fetishistic violence. In the ensuing years, Rogers began hog-tying and raping women, and by the late 1980s he was a full-fledged murderer. Rogers' first murder conviction came in 1988, after he fatally stabbed Jennifer Smith outside an Oregon restaurant, but soon more bodies would surface, each of them painting the same dark portrait of their killer. Rogers had developed a taste for heroin-addicted prostitutes. He liked to gain their trust by paying to fondle their feet during their initial outings, before graduating to more extreme behavior. After he got the women comfortable, he would hog-tie them and start acting out his more sinister urges. An avid foot fetishist, Rogers enjoyed biting feet, among other body parts. Sometimes he sawed his victims' feet completely off, He would also slam captive women's heads against hard surfaces, slap them around and verbally degrade them. The more they screamed and suffered, the more excited Rogers got. Once he was done toying with his prey, only death and mutilation remained. One woman was disemboweled from pelvis to sternum. When all was said and done, Rogers had at least 8 dead bodies to his name. More than a dozen prostitutes who managed to escape Rogers endured traumatic assaults. Yet despite his penchant for life-taking, Rogers fought vigorously to stave off the death penalty, which he received and evaded 3 different times in various technicalities. In 2015, an Oregon jury sentenced the serial killer to death for a 4th, perhaps final, time. Thank you guys for watching and listening. Please be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so. And if you are subscribed, please make sure to leave a like, as it helps my video perform at a much higher level. And if you're new to the channel, drop a comment in the comments section. All of my subscribers are very nice and inviting to new people. If you want your story featured on an upcoming video, email me at the email in the description box below. And until we meet again, stay sinful.